the old saying is true. Yeah? The first duty of government, above all others, is the defence of the realm. Now, my dad died when I was 14 years of age. Right? These things happen. But he drummed into me as a kid, son, never ever take living in a free country for granted. And I think a D-Day veteran's got a right to make that argument. And I've tried never to forget that, and that's kind of guided me in my politics ever since.
Today it's absolutely brilliant to be in Parliament, in the office of a Member of Parliament, and that is Mark Francois. Mark, how are you?
All right, fine, thank you.
Well, thanks for meeting up again, because you were one of the first people I came to see in the early days when I was thinking about setting up something to help get more veterans and reservists into politics, and you were very generous with your time and advice back then. But I've always wanted to sit down and interview you because, of course, we do share a connection to the armed forces, and not just the armed forces but the reserve forces, the Queen's Division as well, because I served in the Queen's Division. But on that, can you just tell us a little bit, like all our guests, about your military story? Why did you join, and perhaps some of the highs and experiences of that time?
Well, my genesis in military terms was the fact that my father was a D-Day veteran. So, Stoker First Class, Reginald Francois, aged 19, was on a minesweeper called HMS Brassey at D-Day. And many years later, after the war, after I'd come along, like many veterans, he wouldn't talk about it. But there was just this one evening, he'd come back, I think, from a naval reunion in London, and I think he had a couple of sherbets, and I would normally have been long to bed, but for some reason the Lord was kind, and I just stayed up late that night. And Dad came in and he just started talking about it, and he didn't glory about it or anything like that, far from it. I mean, he talked about how many very good men had died that day, but he just brought the whole thing to life. And as a young man, I was fascinated in history and military history and the run up to the Second World War, and he was this guy called Winston Churchill who warned everyone what Hitler was up to, and he was a member of Parliament, this Churchill fellow, and what was all that about, and he gave these speeches in the House of Commons, and what was all that about. And the more I read about it, the more fascinated I became. And so by about the age of 13, I decided I ultimately wanted to be an MP. But I went off to university in the early 80s. I read history at Bristol, and I joined the Bristol University Officer Training Corps there, BUATC, and did 3 years there. Then I went to London and did a Masters in War Studies, and so I switched to London ATC. And I'd got commissioned in the meantime. And then when I graduated from London, I went back to my home county of Essex, and I joined the Royal Anglian Regiment. So remember, this is the Cold War, the Berlin Wall is still up. So in those days, the Royal Anglians, part of the Queen's Division, had 3 regular battalions and 3 TA, Army Reserve today, but Territorial Army then. And I served in 5 Royal Anglian. And I eventually handed my kit back after the Berlin Wall came down, and then decided to pursue a career in politics, because I'd still ultimately wanted to be an MP. So after the war came down was one of those times in life when the road forked, and I was being encouraged to stand for local government back in Basildon where I lived, so I chose the political route. But I love being in the TA. It's a great thing to do when you're young and fit and haven't got too many other commitments.
And how old were you when you had that conversation with your dad?
The D-Day chat, I would have been about 10, I think.
Wow.
About that. Yeah. I wrote an autobiography called Spartan Victory. Still available on Amazon for any of your viewers that are interested, and it talks all about all of that in there. So it's mainly about Brexit, but it talks about how I got into politics and all that sort of stuff.
And I think if we have a common factor with all of our guests, including for me actually, of why did you join, either the father or the grandfather pops up in conversation. When I sat down with Ian Duncan Smith, and he spoke about the tale of his father, Spitfire race from that generation.
Smithy Duncan Smith.
Amazing generation of Second World War, and that was obviously growing up, seeing that generation, being lucky enough to have met that generation as well. But I think it was a common factor. My own grandfather served in my antecedent regiments of the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment in the Royal West Kents. Okay. And that influence, I think, on my service, absolutely, from getting me into the cadets and then later joining the same regiment, in fact. So yeah, that's a common factor with a lot of people, a lot of the politicians I've met that have served. It's a thing that comes up time and time again. So it just shows the power of that as well. And you mentioned as well that you decided you wanted to be an MP at quite a young age, at 13, and you were pretty political from a young age as well, and that began in local government, which is something I always evangelise, having spent a lot of time, my political time, working in local government. And that's been a traditional route for a lot of MPs, local government, becoming an MP. I mean, have you seen that route change in recent times, of that kind of well-trodden path from local government into Parliament? And what advice would you give to people that are thinking about it, younger people or those from our armed forces community as well?
Well, yeah, there was a kind of traditional route whereby you started off as a local councillor and kind of cut your teeth doing that. And if you really enjoyed that and you ultimately had parliamentary ambitions, maybe you'd fight a tough seat first, a bit sort of behind enemy lines. So
they use that phrase "no hoper," don't they?
Well, I fought Ken Livingstone in Brent East in 1997 in the dying years of the major government, and I'm here to tell you that was a no hoper. But I cut my teeth, quotes parliamentary wise, doing that. And then fortunately after doing that, I mean, I got slaughtered, but I had to spend 2 years doing it, so I learned my trade in a sense. And then I was very lucky to get selected for Rayleigh in 2000. I had to beat Boris to get it.
Did you really?
I did, yeah, it's all in the book. And so then I got elected in 2001, so I've been an MP now for about 22 years. So, if you're interested in politics and you want to see what it's really like when it's like dealing with constituents, trying to help people, trying to resolve problems, being part of a bigger team, which is something that people with a military background hopefully instinctively understand, that a good way of dipping your toe in the water is to try and stand for your local council. Most councillors do a 4-year term. So, if you can survive 4 years in local politics and enjoy it and get some buzz out of it and think you're adding value, then maybe Parliament might beckon after that.
And of course, there's a lot of difference that people can make in their communities in local government, and whether it's a cabinet or committee style, they can actually physically change their communities, and then they have access to budget, right? These local councils. So
yes, they do, and so a lot of the services that people rely on are delivered locally by their local authority. Everything from picking the bins up to trying to maintain the roads to deciding via planning where you can and can't build, environmental health, education, social services. So many of these services that affect people's everyday lives and the lives of their families are provided at local government level and overseen by democratically elected councillors.
And this is where veterans are going to resettle. They'll resettle into communities. So I always evangelise. If you resettle in your community, and it is a challenging transitioning out of the military is challenging, but you can shape your community by standing up and serving again. And local government is a brilliant way. Or there are obviously loads of ways in which you can shape your community as well.
If you served in the military, you understand the concept of a mission, right? You understand the concept of trying to get something done, even if it's difficult. You understand the concept of being part of a bigger team. You understand the concept of at least a certain degree of discipline within your council group. So if you want to go into politics, having a military background is by no means a disadvantage. In fact, quite the opposite. And the one thing a lot of people don't know is there's over 40 MPs in the current House of Commons who've either had regular or reserve service. Most of those, but not all, are Conservative MPs. But there are MPs from other parties as well. So, well over 5% of the House of Commons has got military experience. A lot of people don't realise that.
Yeah, and we don't know how many. Perhaps we should go to the Local Government Association and find out how many veterans and reservists we've got within local government as well. And that's something I've on the long list of things to do, because I'd love to see more in local government. That's for sure. And becoming an MP, 20 odd years now as an MP, but my first real recollection of you was as a minister at the Ministry of Defence, and I served as a civil servant in the Ministry of Defence within a piece of work that you helped bring into being, which is this stuff around the Armed Forces Covenant. Well, first of all, thank you. It's nice to be able to thank you for that work. We've come a long way over the last decade or so with the Armed Forces Covenant. I've been on LinkedIn today and I've seen a lot of debate amongst veterans talking about the Armed Forces Covenant, and we go around the buoy of, is it worth it, is it a badge of honour, etc. But I've seen it change unrecognisably, the landscape, particularly in the employment space for veterans and reservists, and that started with you and the team that you had at the MOD, and the leadership of David Cameron, quite frankly, at the time. So on that, how have you seen the Covenant evolve over the last decade or so, and what was the biggest achievement for you as your time as a minister?
Well, you're being very generous there, I think, but when I became the Veterans Minister in 2012, one of the things we were in the process of doing was changing the name, which might sound esoteric, but there was a point to it, because up to that point it was known as the Military Covenant, and some people thought that meant it only applied to the Army. So it was changed to the Armed Forces Covenant to make plain that it applied to all three services, and indeed the wider Armed Forces family.
Was there much pushback at the time, or when that changed?
Not really. I think even the Army thought it wasn't such a bad idea. So, and it was all based on the principle of no disadvantage, in essence, that service personnel and their families shouldn't experience disadvantage in life because they happen to have chosen a military career. So, and where I sort of broadened it out a bit was I came up with the corporate element of that, what we initially called the corporate covenant, because we found that individuals could sign up to do the right thing by our armed forces, but there wasn't really a facility for entities like companies or NHS trusts, for organisations to do it. So we brought in what was christened as the corporate covenant, and I remember writing to the CEOs of the FTSE top 100 companies, the biggest companies in Britain, with a prospectus about it. And on the day that I wrote that letter, we had none. And I think now there are over 5,000 companies, big and small, across the UK who've signed up. And what does that mean? It means a range of things. So things like they support Armed Forces Week and Armed Forces Day. Yes, they encourage veterans to wear their uniform at work, maybe on Armed Forces Day, to try and show to their co-workers and colleagues that other part of their life. It means prioritising veterans when you get an interview, that we get the number of them to sign up to say if a veteran applies for a job, you don't guarantee to give them the job because you're going to want to pick the best candidate on merit. Absolutely. So you at least give them an interview, you give them a chance to make their case, and what you find is that often in many cases they pick the veteran. Yeah, but that's not mandatory. And so there's a whole, supporting armed forces charities, there are a whole range of things that companies could do, and some pride themselves on employing veterans, particularly in the security industry and places like that. So it grew, and if you come back to local government that you mentioned, most councils now have an armed forces champion, who is a councillor that's specifically empowered to help champion the military covenant and armed forces personnel. And where that, for instance, has a practical application, is, say, in housing, where some local authorities now, will give veterans recognition when they're applying for housing. So, for instance, a lot of councils have a rule now where if you haven't lived in their area for so many years, you can't apply for council or social housing. But if you're a veteran who's been away because of military service, they'll take a more understanding attitude to that rule, for instance. So there are ways that veterans serving in local government are able to, at least even up the playing field for people who've served in in the armed forces and their families. So, slightly long answer to your question, but I think some good came of it. And just behind you on the wall there is the Essex Armed Forces Covenant, as signed at County Hall in Chelmsford. So I had a little bit to do with that.
This stuff matters, right? I mean, you must look back and think it's quite a counter-culture idea at the time. There was a lot at the time. I remember looking back, and I ended up working in a team called Defence Relationship Management that handled the covenant signings and the employee recognition scheme of the Bronze, Silver and Gold Awards. And I remember seeing that at the early days there was this kind of cultural thing, a bit of a pushback sometimes, but being seen as a little bit American. But I think where we've come now is it's fully embedded, and you just see the response to Reserves Day, as you mentioned, and to the Armed Forces Week as well. I think we've come a long way, and that all started with that vision early on in 2012 of getting that through.
Well, I'd say you're being very kind. I mean, the military covenant was there before I joined the MOD, but what we did maybe was we just, we embellished it a bit, and we tried to take it into the corporate sector. And trying to get businesses and other public sector organisations to put their shoulder to the wheel, and I think we've had some success with that at least. Yeah.
Anything else? Your greatest achievement as a minister? Anything else?
The Geniums. So one thing that annoyed me when I joined the department was that we gave guys who'd lost limbs in Iraq or Afghanistan, we gave them a prosthetic leg, but it was not the world standard leg. And at the time, the world standard leg was a thing called the Genium, which was an American model, and the only guy in the armed forces was a guy who was a shot putter, and we'd given one to him. He was a corporal, to help him compete. And I said, well, why haven't all our other guys got the world standard leg? Anyway, about 9 months and some millions of pounds and discussions with the Treasury and endless meetings later, we managed to bring that in so that those who could clinically benefit from it would get the Genium leg. Because if I stopped 100 of my constituents walking down Rayleigh High Street, remember the context, this was what we were still in Afghanistan at the time. If I stopped 100 of my constituents walking down Rayleigh High Street and said, if a guy's lost his legs, fighting for Queen and country as it was, in Afghanistan, do you think we should give him the best prosthetic legs money can buy? I bet 99 of my constituents would have said, well, why aren't we doing it already? Absolutely. So if I never do anything else in politics, I did that. And I saw some video a couple of years later of a guy on a treadmill at what had been Headley Court, it's the DNRC now, running on a treadmill with a pair of Geniums. And to be honest, it was slightly emotional.
Yeah, well...
So if I never do anything else in politics, I managed to achieve that.
Well, I think, as I said to you before we came on camera, I'm a member of the Invictus Games, Team UK, and there's a lot of leg chat with my mates when, for those that do have prosthetics, and about how it's improved their lives. But not only that, they're actually competing internationally in sport as well, and seeing people not only compete in sport, but having transitioned out of the military, they're employed successfully, and even one of my mates is on the parliamentary candidates list as well for the Conservative Party. So these people are going on doing amazing things, and it just has to start with something, right? Whether it be the vision of the Covenant and the interjections from yourself and others in the team of the MOD, and look how far we've come.
Well, military personnel tend to be very employable. So when I was in the department, 10 years ago now, we had a thing called the Career Transition Partnership, which is if you were leaving, they were people that would help you, prepare your CV, help you with job interviews, help you find a job, and they would interface with what is now the Department of Work and Pensions Job Centre network. And even then, I think the stat was off the top of my head, this is about 80% of service leavers found regular employment, either part or full time.
I think it's up to 96 now.
Well, that was in 6 months, yeah. Well, there you are. So that's what, by my maths, that's 19 out of 20, right? Obviously, we've got one good thing about the economy is that we've got record low unemployment, or near record low unemployment at the moment. So that's good. And military personnel, because they know a bit about discipline and turning up on time, and they're task orientated, and they're taught to be innovative and get the job done and think laterally and all those good things. They make very good employees. Flip side of that is the forces are suffering by the number of people that are leaving, but that's a parallel issue. But it does mean that most people who leave the armed forces don't have too much trouble getting a job. There are obviously exceptions to that, but ex-armed forces personnel in general are very employable.
And you're still involved in defence, of course, through the Defence Select Committee and the Defence Subcommittee. A lot of people, they'll see these in their news headlines if there's been a particularly spicy interview, if someone's been hauled in front of the Defence Select Committee. I must confess, I do tune in quite, and sometimes it's enjoyable to see certain people being hauled in front of certain select committees and being, raked over the coals. But in all seriousness, can you help explain to our listeners what is the role of the Defence Select Committee, and what's that piece of work that you're working on with that subcommittee as well within Defence?
Okay, so one of the reforms that Margaret Thatcher brought in 1979 to Parliament was she set up what's called the Select Committee system. So in simple terms, each department of government has a committee of MPs drawn from across the parties that scrutinise the work of that department and then produce reports for the wider House of Commons and for the media and the general public about some aspect or another of what that department has been doing, right? And the Defence Select Committee is the one that scrutinises the Ministry of Defence. It's got 11 members on it, and it's got a Tory chairman, Tobias Ellwood, who's a former Green Jacket. Interestingly, of those 11 members of the committee, 6 are former MOD ministers.
I was going to say, including on the Labour side as well.
Correct. So you've got 3 Labour former ministers. So you've got John Speller and Kevin Jones and Derek Twigg, all of whom served in the MOD as ministers, and then you've got 3 on our side as well. So what that means is we're difficult to bluff. Right, we kind of collectively we sort of know our onions, and there have been a few occasions where even very senior officers have come in and tried to bluff the committee, and it usually doesn't profit them. And we haven't got worldwide viewing figures. I don't want to kid you, but what has been interesting, particularly in the last few years, is when we've been on visits to military facilities, which we do a lot. There's that old infantry saying, time spent on reconnaissance is rarely wasted, right? So if you want to know what's going on, you've got to go and talk to the troops. And we've been told increasingly on some of these visits, or actually, a lot of our guys were in the mess watching your hearing last week. So some of them, so for instance, we had quite a high profile one where we were questioning the then head of the Royal Air Force, Air Chief Marshal Sir Mike Wigston, about this hot water he got into, regarding recruitment of, progressing certain ethnic groups at the expense of others. And we gave him a pretty hard time over that. And someone told me that in the mess at RAF Cranwell, they had it on the telly, and when Tobias asked him if the wrong officer resigned, the whole mess burst into applause. Now, I wasn't at the mess at RAF Cranwell, but I've got no reason to believe the young officer who told me that was lying. So there is a bit of a following, I wouldn't put it any stronger than that, within the armed forces community, particularly if we're talking about something that directly affects them and their families. So I'm in the middle of leading a subcommittee of the main committee looking at defence procurement and what's wrong with that, and we're hoping to produce our report by the summer recess. And then the next topic the subcommittee is going to look into is service family accommodation. Service accommodation in general, and that will be chaired by my colleague Robert Courts, who's an ex-transport minister, and he's the member for Witney, which is David Cameron's old constituency, and he's got RF Bryce Norton in his patch, so he knows a lot about it. He's got the whole Carter to the state. So in the autumn we'll transition to looking at that, and we do have the ability to hold ministers and senior civil servants and senior officers to account, and I hope we're not unfair in our questioning, but we do push people pretty hard. Yeah, right? And
they shift the dial, right? So if you look at Sarah Atherton with her work on women's experience in the armed forces, it matters. It actually changes stuff down to...
Sarah's report was really groundbreaking, and it's led to a lot of positive change. And Johnny Mercer did one on vexatious complaints against veterans, mainly relating to Iraq and Afghanistan. That led to legislation. So some of our reports have had, quite a practical impact, I think, hopefully for the better. So I think we're regarded as one of the more effective select committees. I wouldn't say the most, that's a bit of a big boast, but I think we're regarded as one of the best select committees in the House.
Yeah, do tune in on Parliament TV, that's all I can say to our listeners and viewers here.
Yeah. So anyway, we try.
And of course, defence is a fascinating subject to be involved in. Many of our listeners have that background, having served themselves or still serving. People come up to me and tell me that they listen to the podcast and it sparked an interest, not just because of the conversations around politics, but the defence conversations that we have, because I interview people that have served and from this community. But we do live in this complex world. There's no denying it. We just see it on our TV screens, and the technicolor view of warfare that all of us are seeing played out in Ukraine at the moment and elsewhere. How prepared are we going forward? We've seen a consensus in Parliament in support to Ukraine, which has been fantastic to see. But how prepared are we more globally to face these threats in the post-Iraq Afghan world, with what we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine, and how prepared are we now for the future, would you say?
Well, good question. In Iraq and Afghanistan, both campaigns were controversial, but they were what you might call wars of choice. We decided to become involved in those conflicts. There are then what are sometimes called wars of necessity, where you haven't got a choice, and the Second World War is the classic example of that. We ended up fighting war of national survival. With Ukraine, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said at the end of last year that conflict could expand and NATO could be dragged in, which of course would include us as a fundamental member of NATO. So without scaremongering, it is not inconceivable that we could end up in a wider conflict. Are we prepared for that? We're not as prepared as we should be. There are a whole range of reasons for that. And as we're doing this interview, this week you're going to have the NATO summit in Vilnius, and NATO, I think, and I hope, is going to be having a long, hard look at itself on whether or not, it's really, match fit, to use an expression Ben Wallace likes to use. So, we spend about £50 billion of taxpayers' money a year on defence in this country, and one of the themes of the committee's reports for the last few years has been that we're not necessarily spending that money as effectively as we might do, and we could spend some of that money far better, and that is something where the committee tries to make a difference.
Mark, it's remarkable that we've had that commentary on NATO, and I really appreciate that insight. But it's also remarkable we've got through his interview without even talking about Brexit as well, which is quite.
Well, I was very involved in Brexit, as some people know. I still believe we were right to leave the EU. I campaigned for it. Spartan Victory is mainly about that battle in Parliament to deliver it. But hopefully, I'm not a complete one-club golfer.
No.
And defence is a very important subject. I mean, the old saying is true. Yeah, the first duty of government, above all others, is the defence of the realm. Now, my dad died when I was 14 years of age. Right? These things happen. But he drummed into me as a kid, son, never ever take living in a free country for granted. And I think a D-Day veteran's got a right to make that argument. And I've tried never to forget that, and that's kind of guided me in my politics ever since. And if you look at the Korean War Memorial in Washington, which is this amazing memorial of a kind of platoon of guys in rain-soaked ponchos walking up a hill, it's brilliantly created. And the inscription just reads, "Freedom isn't free." And it still isn't. And if we want to live in a free society, which I'm sure your listeners do, we're going to have to defend that, and that costs money. and it means training and preparedness. Because if you believe, as I do, that the role of the armed forces is to save life by deterring war, by persuading any potential aggressor, there's no point starting because we'll beat you, you can't win, then you've got to have the equipment and the training and the personnel that are ready to back that up, right? And we've got the right people. We're still managing to get the right people, though we're struggling to hang on to them for a variety of reasons. In many ways, where we're now deficient is the kit. And that's something that my subcommittee's been looking at, and hopefully we'll have more to say about that by the time the House rises in a couple of weeks' time. But we've still got the right stuff. We still have among the best armed forces of the world in terms of the quality of their personnel, but in kit terms we've got work to do.
And freedom isn't free.
Never was, never will be.
I think on those sage words, Mark, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.